The wind was a blade against her skin, honed on the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. It stripped the warmth from her woolen cloak and left an ache deep in her bones, a cold that had little to do with the snow clinging to the high passes. Elara kept her eyes fixed on the worn leather boots of the man in front of her, Joran, his broad back a wall of grim silence. He had not spoken a word to her in 2 days, not since they had left the relative shelter of the lowlands and begun this ascent into the realm of the giant. She was a parcel to be delivered, nothing more. Peace offering, a sacrifice. Her left leg throbbed with a familiar, weary rhythm, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. The fever that had marked her as a child had left her with this uneven gait, a permanent reminder of her otherness. It had also left a faint, silvered tracery on her cheek, a delicate scar that caught the flat gray light like a spider's thread. These marks, along with a spirit that refused to be entirely broken, had sealed her fate. When the elders had gathered to discuss the terms of the reclusive man of the mountain, the giant, as the children whispered, they had needed a tribute. The story said he was a monster of immense size and brutish temper, driven from the southern lands for some unspeakable crime, now claiming the high hunting grounds that the tribe desperately needed to survive the coming winter. He had demanded a bride, a warrior to be his mate. The council, led by the pragmatic and cruel chieftain, had smiled. They had promised him their most beautiful warrior. Elara was not beautiful. She knew this with the stark, unadorned clarity of someone who has been told it, in word and deed, their entire life. She was strong in her own way, her hands deft with a needle and a skinning knife, her mind sharp enough to track the seasons and the stars. She could read the land and its moods, but she could not wield a spear with the grace of the other women. Her leg would not allow for the swiftness of a true huntress, and her face did not hold the smooth, unblemished perfection the tribe valued above all else. So they had dressed her in the ceremonial furs of a warrior bride, braided her dark hair with beads of bone and river stone, and sent her away. It was a clever, cruel deception. They were sending a broken thing to a monster, hoping he would be sated or, perhaps, enraged enough to be lured into a trap. Either way, Elara would be gone. The thought was a stone in her gut. She was an offering meant to be broken. The air grew thinner, tasting of iron and ice. The path narrowed to a treacherous ledge, a dizzying drop on one side where the world fell away into a chasm of swirling mist. Joran, her escort, paused and pointed a leather-gloved finger ahead. Through the snow flurries, she could see it. A structure, not a cave, but a house built of massive, dark stones, fitted together with impossible precision. It seemed to grow from the mountain itself, a bastion against the sky, smoke curling from a chimney like a slow, gray breath. This was the giant's lair. Her fear, a constant companion on the journey, tightened its grip, stealing the air from her lungs. This was the end of her path. Joran untied the small pack from his own shoulders and set it at her feet. It contained a change of clothes, a small block of dried meat, and a water skin. Pathetic dowry. He looked at her then, his eyes flat and devoid of pity. "He will be expecting you," was all he said. He did not wish her well. He did not apologize. He simply turned and began his descent, his form quickly swallowed by the snow. Elara stood alone, the wind whipping her hair across her face, the silence of the mountain pressing in on all sides. She was a ghost on the edge of the world. Despair was a tempting abyss, a whisper that told her to simply step off the ledge and let the wind take her. But the same stubbornness that had made her an outcast now held her rooted to the spot. She had been sent here to die one way or another. She would not make it easy for them. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that burned her lungs, she straightened her shoulders, the ceremonial furs heavy and foreign. She picked up the pack and began the final walk, her limp more pronounced on the uneven, icy ground. Each step was an act of defiance. The door was a slab of dark wood, banded with black iron, as tall as 2 men. There was no knocker, no bell. She hesitated for only a moment before raising a fist and striking the wood. The sound was swallowed by the immensity of the stone and the wind. She waited, Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, the impact jarring her arm. For a long moment, the only answer was the keening of the wind. She was about to turn, to consider the impossible choice of freezing on his doorstep or attempting the descent alone, when she heard it. A scraping sound from within, the groan of a heavy bolt being drawn. The door swung inward, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate weight. The man who stood there filled the frame. He was not a giant of myth, not a creature of scales and fangs, but he was larger than any man she had ever seen. His shoulders were as broad as the door itself, his height forcing him to stoop slightly. A thick, untamed beard, the color of winter dusk, covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was a dark, shaggy mane. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, piercing gray, the color of the mountain stone around them, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. They swept over her, from the beaded braids to the worn hem of her cloak, lingering for a moment on the faint scar on her cheek, then dropping to her uneven stance. She saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not rage, not lust, but a quiet, profound confusion. He had been promised their most beautiful warrior. He had been given her. The lie of her people stood starkly between them, more vast and chilling than the chasm she had just passed. He said nothing, simply stepped back, a silent invitation into the shadows of his home. The weeks that followed were a study in silence. The man, he never offered a name and she never dared to ask, moved through his stone dwelling with a quiet economy of motion that belied his size. The interior was surprisingly sparse and clean. A large hearth dominated the main room, its fire the house's beating heart, casting flickering shadows on the smooth stone walls. Furs were piled on a raised sleeping platform, and a long wooden table with 2 benches stood in the center of the room. Everything was built to his scale, making her feel small and fragile. He gave her a space on a smaller platform near the hearth, a pile of soft rabbit furs for her bed. He did not touch her. He barely spoke. Her days fell into a simple, unspoken rhythm. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire back to life. He would leave for hours, returning with game. A brace of mountain hares, a young deer slung over his massive shoulders, or with wood for the fire, cut and split with an axe that looked like a child's toy in his hands. He would set his bounty on the table, and it was her task to prepare it. She skinned the animals, her knife moving with a practiced skill that was the one legacy of her difficult life. She stretched and cured the hides, her hands growing raw from the work but her mind finding a strange peace in the focus it required. She cooked the meat in a heavy iron pot over the fire, the simple stews filling the silent house with the only warmth that was not from the flames. They ate at the great table, sitting at opposite ends, the space between them a vast, uncharted territory. His eyes would watch her, not with menace, but with a constant, searching curiosity. He was trying to solve the riddle of her, the broken offering sent to a monster. She, in turn, watched him. She saw the callous strength in his hands as he mended a strap of leather, the surprising gentleness with which he treated his tools. She saw the weariness in his shoulders when he returned from a long hunt in a blizzard. One evening, he brought in a small, shivering bird, one of its wings clearly broken. She expected him to kill it for the pot, but instead, he sat by the fire, and with a focus she found breathtaking, he fashioned a tiny splint from a twig and a strip of linen. He worked for nearly an hour, his huge, clumsy-looking fingers moving with painstaking delicacy. When he was done, he placed the bird in a small wooden box lined with fleece and set it near the hearth. He did not look at her, did not seek her approval, but she felt a shift inside her. This was not the act of a brute. The silence was a weight, but it was also a canvas. Without words, every action became significant. When her thread ran out, she gestured to the empty spool. The next day, a new one, spun from fine, strong wool, was sitting on the table. When she saw him wince as he stretched his back, she brewed a tea from the willow bark and mountain herbs she'd gathered on a rare sunny afternoon, leaving the steaming mug on the table for him. He drank it without comment, But the next time he went to the lower slopes, he returned with a handful of the same herbs and left them in her drying basket. It was a language of gestures, of needs anticipated and met without the clutter of speech. A fragile trust began to sprout in the barren soil of their shared isolation, a green and tender thing. One night, the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. It descended upon the mountain with a furious, elemental violence. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow beat against the stone walls with the force of thrown gravel. The world outside was a white, roaring chaos. Alara sat by the fire, stitching a patch onto one of his worn tunics, the simple act of comfort against the storm's rage. The giant sat across from her, sharpening a large hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, 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 a steady presence in the room. The firelight carved his face from the shadows, making the planes of his cheeks and brow seem like carved rock. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly look at him, not as a monster or a captor, but as a man. He was scarred, she noticed. A long, thin white line ran from his temple into his beard, and the knuckles on his left hand were misshapen, as if they had been broken and healed poorly. He was marked just as she was, an outcast. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the house, and the great wooden door shuddered in its frame. The fire faltered, sending a plume of smoke into the room. Despite the roaring hearth, a bone-deep chill seemed to seep through the very stones. She shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. He stopped his work, his gray eyes lifting to meet hers across the flames. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he rose. He walked not to the fire, but to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room. He lifted the heavy lid and pulled out a massive fur, the pelt of a great snow bear, thick and white and exquisitely cured. He walked over to where she sat and, without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immense, a profound and solid warmth that enveloped her completely. It smelled of cedar and cold, clean air, of him. She looked up at him, startled by the proximity, by the sheer unexpectedness of the gesture. He stood over her, a mountain of a man, his shadow swallowing her. But for the first time she felt no fear. His hand, large enough to crush her skull, brushed her shoulder as he adjusted the fur, his touch surprisingly gentle. His gray eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw not confusion or pity, but a flicker of something else. Understanding. Acknowledgement. In the heart of the storm, trapped in their stone sanctuary, a single, silent act of kindness had spoken more than 1,000 words. He returned to his seat, picking up his knife and stone as if nothing had happened, but the space between them felt smaller, the silence warmer, the storm outside a distant, impotent thing. She lowered her head, hiding the faint smile that touched her lips, and continued her stitching. The heavy, warm weight of the bear pelt a silent promise on her shoulders. She had been sent as a lie, but perhaps, in this quiet, lonely place, she was beginning to find a truth. The snows eventually receded, surrendering the lower slopes to the pale green of spring. The days grew longer, and the silence between Alara and the man she had come to know as Kalen, a name she had seen carved into the handle of an axe, had softened into a comfortable quiet. It was a life of shared rhythms, no longer defined by fear, but by a mutual unspoken respect. She learned the subtle shifts in the mountain's mood by the way he packed his gear for the day's hunt. He learned her needs by the way she laid out herbs to dry or mended a specific tool. The splinted bird, now healed, had flown free one bright morning, and she had seen a rare, fleeting smile touch his lips as it soared into the blue expanse. She had begun to think of this stone house not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. The world of her tribe, with its cruel judgments and rigid expectations, felt a lifetime away. But the world has a long memory. One afternoon, while she was scraping a deer hide stretched on a frame outside the house, she heard it. Voices, not the echo of the wind or the call of a hawk, but the harsh, guttural sound of men. Her blood ran cold. She looked down the path, her heart seizing in her chest. 3 figures were making their way up the final ascent. She recognized them immediately. Orin, the chieftain's son, his face set in a familiar, arrogant sneer. With him were two of his most loyal hunters, burly men who had always looked at her with a mixture of contempt and pity. Orin carried a fine, steel-tipped spear, a weapon of war, not of hunting. They had not come for peace. Kalen was away, checking his trap lines on the far side of the peak. A wave of pure terror washed over her. She was alone. Her first instinct was to run, to hide inside the stone house and bar the great door. But the sight of Orin's cruel smile froze her. He had always been the architect of her deepest humiliations. To show him fear now felt like a betrayal of the quiet dignity she had found on this mountain. She dropped the scraper, her hand resting on the hilt of the small skinning knife at her belt. It was a pitiful weapon against 3 armed men, but it was something. She stood her ground, her chin lifted, the wind catching the strands of her dark hair. "Look what the beast has left out to dry," Orin called out, his voice laced with mocking amusement as he drew closer. "The broken offering. I am surprised he has not eaten you yet." The other 2 men chuckled, their eyes roving over her, taking in the clean, well-made clothes Kalen had provided, the healthy color in her cheeks. They had expected to find a corpse or a terrorized slave. They had not expected this quiet composure. "What do you want, Orin?" Alara's voice was steadier than she felt, the sound of it strange in the mountain air after so long with so few words. "We have come for the giant's head," Orin said, tapping the point of his spear on a rock. "The council grows impatient. He has the hunting grounds and our people go hungry. We thought his new pet might tell us his weaknesses. Or perhaps you would like to come back with us. We can find a place for you in the scullery." His gaze flickered to her leg, a deliberate, cruel insult. "This is my home now," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You are not welcome here. Leave." Orin laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the mountain's peace. "Your home? With that monster? Did you forget what you are? Little cripple? You are nothing. A sacrifice we threw away. You belong to the tribe." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to grab her. "Now you will be useful. You will lure him out for us." At that moment, a shadow fell over them. Alara did not need to turn to know who it was. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, colder. Orin and his men froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Kalen stood at the edge of the clearing, having approached with the silence of a hunting cat. He held a massive bow in one hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. He was not breathing heavily from his climb. He simply stood there, a figure of granite and fury, his gray eyes fixed on Orin's hand, which was still reaching for Alara. "Take your hand away from her." Kalen's voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep within the earth. It was the first full sentence she had ever heard him speak. Orin, though visibly shaken by Kalen's sudden appearance and sheer size, was too proud to back down immediately. He puffed out his chest. "This is tribe business, beast. The woman is ours. We sent her to you as a trick. Did you really think we would give a monster our best? We gave you our worst." He spat the words, aiming them like poison darts, meant to wound them both. Alara felt the old shame rise, hot and bitter. But then, she felt something else rise to meet it. A cold, hard anger. She had been their worst, their broken thing. Here she was not. Kalen had never once made her feel less than whole. He had seen her skill, her resilience. He had covered her with his own blanket. Before Kalen could move, before the arrow could be drawn, Alara stepped forward. She did not step behind Kalen for protection. She stepped to his side, placing herself between him and Orin. She looked directly into the chieftain's son's eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "You are wrong," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the thin air. "You did not send him your worst. You sent him the one person who was strong enough to survive it." She took another step, her limp barely noticeable, her posture radiating a strength she had never known she possessed. "You talk of strength, Orin? You who hide behind 2 men and use a woman as bait. You who would see your own people starve out of pride and greed. That is not strength. It is cowardice. She gestured to Kaelin, not as a monster, but as her partner. This man has shown more honor in his silence than you have in your entire life of loudmouthed boasting. He protects this mountain. He lives with it, not against it. You only seek to bleed it dry. She looked from Orin to his men, her eyes sharp with contempt. Now you will leave this place, and you will not come back. The giant you fear is not him. It is the hunger and desperation you will bring upon your own people. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Orin stared at her, his mouth agape, utterly thrown by her defiance. He had expected a cowering victim, not this fierce, articulate woman standing shoulder to shoulder with the very man he'd come to kill. He looked from her resolute face to Kaelin's immense, unmoving form, the arrow still aimed at his heart. He saw not a monster and his pet, but an unbreakable, united front. The courage of his men evaporated. They glanced at each other, then at Orin, their expressions shifting from aggression to uncertainty. They had come to fight a simple-minded brute, not to wage a war against the mountain itself, defended by a woman with fire in her eyes and a giant at her back. Orin's sneer faltered. He saw the truth in her words, the truth of his own weakness reflected in her strength. Without another word, he lowered his spear, turned, and scrambled back down the path. His men close on his heels, their retreat clumsy and shameful. The quiet that descended in their wake was different from the silence that had come before. It was not empty, but full. Full of the echoes of her words, of the tension of the standoff, of a victory won not with weapons, but with will. Alara stood watching them go, her body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation, but her spirit soaring. She had faced down her past, her tormentors, and she had not flinched. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face, and she brushed it away, her hand steady. Kaelin slowly unknocked his arrow, his gaze leaving the retreating figures to rest on her. He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stopped in front of her, his great height forcing her to tilt her head back. She met his gaze, unafraid. The pale gray eyes that had once held only confusion now held something akin to awe. He looked at the faint silver scar on her cheek, not as a flaw, but as a part of her, a line in a story he was just beginning to understand. His hand came up, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he might touch her face. Instead, his fingers gently brushed the sleeve of her tunic, a touch so light it was barely there. "You are not what they promised," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, the sound no longer startling but familiar. A small, genuine smile touched Alara's lips. She looked up at this man, this giant who mended broken birds and shared his warmth against the cold. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the weariness in his eyes, the profound loneliness he had carried for so long. She saw the truth of him, just as he had finally seen the truth of her. "Neither are you," she replied softly. The tribe had sent a lie, a deception wrapped in ceremonial furs. They had intended her to be a weakness, an offering to be consumed and discarded. They had never understood. Her worth was not in a flawless face or a warrior's speed. It was in the resilience of a spirit that refused to break, the quiet strength of a heart that had learned to survive in the harshest of climates, both inside and out. That was the truth the giant had never seen coming. That was the real tribute. He nodded slowly, a gesture of complete and profound agreement. The vast, unspoken territory between them was finally charted, its borders dissolved. He turned and looked out over the vista from their mountain home. The peaks stood sharp and clear against the afternoon sky, the valleys below bathed in a soft, golden light. It was a harsh and beautiful land, unforgiving and yet full of a fierce, wild life. It was their land. Alara moved to stand beside him, no longer at his side in defiance of an enemy, but in the quiet solidarity of a shared future. The wind was still cold, but it no longer felt like a blade, felt like a promise. Together, they watched the sun begin its slow descent, Two outcasts who had found in each other not what they were promised, but everything they needed.